Hello everyone, my name is Martin Glee Nelson and thank you for tuning in to the Red Tape, Know Your Rights. Today we'll be talking to a community about early voting, which is open right now for November 5th, so make sure to get there, and the final voting day is going to be November 8th. But today we're going to be talking to an advocate in the community fighting on our behalf to let us understand our rights and also answering community questions that you have and that we all need answers to. Today we have with us Senior Associate Attorney Keith S. Smith. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, you have represented child maltreatment cases. You're the first full-time African-American professor at Catawba College. You also worked in corrections for 6 years as a state probation parole officer and prison staffer. And you were also voted as one of the top 100 black men of Charlotte. Thank you so much for joining us. And can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, I'm from the big city of China Grove. Population today about 3,000. When I was growing up, the population was about 2,500. So you can see that major growth explosion as we're coming along. Brooklyn born, China Grove bred. My foundation's China Grove. The people in China Grove molded me, made me. And I think back about my parents. I'm adopted. I think back about my parents, about how phenomenal they were. They were older parents, but they were phenomenal in placing things in me that helped me move forward. I actually disappoint myself because I can't figure out how did they do everything they did with so few resources.
So the work that you're doing now is monumental, and it requires a lot. What do you mean emotionally, spiritually? Do you sometimes feel like this work was a calling as opposed to an actual profession?
Yeah, and I always tell folks, it is a calling because you cannot do this work well if it's not a calling or a ministry. You're not doing it for the money because county, state, and sometimes federal employees are not, overly compensated. So you're doing it because you care about children and families. That is the primary reason I do it. And the fact that I'm adopted, it gives me a little extra angle to push forward, put children in a better position. And not just children, we want to put families in a better position. We want parents to be enabled to do their best for themselves and for their children. No one enjoys, I'm sorry about that speech tick, but no one enjoys taking someone's child into custody.
No.
If the department ends up taking a child into custody, it's because they've pretty well exhausted every remedy that they could utilize.
So what are some of the challenges these families are facing that the public may not even know about?
Lack of housing, which is a preeminent issue in Mecklenburg County. There's a high cost of living. People that have jobs may not be in a position to have a place to stay. And I heard the phrase affordable housing. Affordable housing is what you can afford. And there are a lot of people that just can't afford any level of housing. That's one issue. And the mental health challenges that they've always been there, but I think now it's definitely after COVID, I've seen an explosion of mental health challenges. Substance abuse, of course. When I was a probation parole officer, it was crack and cocaine. Now it's fentanyl and heroin and meth to a degree. So we've seen that change a little bit. And of course, domestic violence is another major issue that we deal with.
Yeah, because even for some of us that are in better position, right, that can afford housing, that have decent paying jobs, the COVID presented a challenge for even those people, right? So now we think about people that are kind of less fortunate or who are facing these challenges. What have you seen being done for those people?
Well, I think the government providers are putting some resources into the community. I'd like to see more, of course, but I think that's the biggest thing. There are funds that are being made available, but the cost of housing is so great, even with some government subsidies and some assistance, is very challenging. I think the community does well with substance abuse treatment, but the challenge of substance abuse treatment is you have to be willing to engage in the services. And most folks don't acknowledge that they have a substance abuse or substance use disorder issue. It is very difficult for someone to admit that they've got that problem. I can't admit that I have an addiction to sugar. So, you start thinking about something that's even more substantial and addictive, you see why they can't let it go.
Right.
But the adverse impact on their children and their families is horrific.
So as voters, right, we're in election season. How can we be empowered? How can we make a change? And some of these things, because housing, substance abuse, families not being able to get enough resources, or the lack of awareness of some of the things that are happening. How do voters make a change?
I think it's unfortunate that so many voters don't see the reality and the purpose of voting, and they don't see how it impacts them individually on a day-to-day basis. The reality is every vote from the local level all the way up to president impacts us. You know, you have great turnouts during the presidential election,
Right.
but now midterms, we'll have to see what the turnout will be like. I think the Senate race, for example, is driving some voters, and there are a number of Senate races throughout states that are driving some voters to the polls, but we have to encourage and empower folk to know that each vote matters. I lost Ford by approximately 49 votes.
Oh, wow.
So every vote matters.
Wow.
Did the recount, it went to 144. So I'm telling you, every vote matters. That's out of 70,000 plus voters in Mecklenburg County. So every vote matters. So we've got to get people to vote. And also understand that sometimes it helps to see folk that look like you in those positions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I said sometimes. I'm not saying blanket, no blanket response or support of certain candidates, but it helps oftentimes.
Yeah, I think so. It's definitely empowering to see someone that looks like you know, that has a very similar background representing you. And it also shows like, man, there's a door open for me to do the same way, to represent someone else that's looking up to me.
And if you look at the legislature, some of the laws that they pass, they trickle down and impact people on the local level, but they also trickle up, because if we look at the congressional districts, we had 13, well now it'll be 14 congressional districts, and the split is 10-3, Republican and Democrat. But the voting population is 50-50. But the legislature drew those lines in such a way that there is such an impact and such a level of disconnectivity in terms of the numbers to how people should be represented.
Well, this is very good information for educated and uneducated voters. So we have a few questions that we wanted to ask, that the community wanted to ask, just to get a better understanding of what this season means and how important voting is. So one of the questions are, what are the local, state, and federal offices or positions that are up for election currently?
We have the state Supreme Court, that is going to be critical. Currently there's a 4-3, and I won't even reference the party, a 4-3 split.
Yeah.
Whomever takes control of that will probably dictate how laws are interpreted and pushed forward. You know, the legislature may pass the laws, but the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals is who actually makes a determination about whether or not these laws are constitutional. And those votes are critical. Going down to the legislative races, those are critical because they're the ones that are passing these laws that include drawing the lines in the districts and whatever it is, whether it's female reproductive rights or marital rights, they're the ones that make those determinations. And going further down, county commissioners, they dictate how local funds are distributed.
Right, right.
City council people, which they just had the election, so it's not on the ballot this time. And I always say, don't forget the judges. Do not forget the judges. And I'm not just talking about judges from a criminal perspective. I'm talking about judges that make decisions about child custody, judges that make decisions about divorce, judges that make decisions about multi-million-dollar suits. We need to have judges that are aware of various circumstances and meet people where they're. And I think we have some great judges, but of course, we always need to select the best judges.
Right, right. I feel like that was very educational. What are the key roles that each position plays, which you already answered, but what strategies should a layperson take to be informed about upcoming elections?
Bree, one of my friends, one of my friends called me today and said, who should I vote for these particular positions? Or who should I consider voting for? Of course, I'm not going to tell them who to vote for, but I'm going to give them information about, well, you can look at this resource and see what their bios are, what their voting positions happen to be, and whether or not that fits what you're concerned about. So asking folk if you don't know, reading. The internet has made everything available.
Right.
Good and bad, like we're talking about free meeting.
Right.
But you can find good, critical, comprehensive information on the internet about these candidates.
From the top of your mind, what are some resources, like from the top of your head?
League of Women Voters, Common Sense, Democracy America, Democracy North Carolina. Those are some local resources that are nonpartisan if people are concerned about they want to lean one way or another way.
Right, absolutely. So we talked about the key elected positions, but what are some of the positions that are affecting Black people the most?
You see the smile, right? Everyone,
Every single one.
everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, from the bottom to the top to the bottom, it all has an impact on people of color. If you're talking about situations involving immigration, the judges, the legislature, they're making decisions about that. If you're talking about funding, Mecklenburg County is what, 30% African American, 3% of the contracts go to African Americans. That's that's an interesting perspective.
Right.
So we need to push and encourage our elected folk to hold themselves and hold us accountable
Right.
for making sure everybody has an opportunity if they're qualified. And I don't think it's the issue of people not being qualified. I think it's resource limitations or people not being aware of resources that exist. Got to be plugged in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But do you think sometimes our community is a little distracted?
By music, by nonsense on the internet, I don't know. I think our folk of color get a really bad rep for, being distracted or not being engaged. The majority of Black folk vote. The majority of Black men are not in prison. The majority of men are married, and if they're not married, they're providing support for their children. So I think that's actually the distraction. The fact that we always hear like, dang, all these Black men are incarcerated. No, they're not. And if you dig down deeper, you look at why we have so many people incarcerated, and you also look at historically, when did that problem begin? That really began after World War II, whenever Black troops returned from World War II and started making some advances and wanted some rights. You started seeing more folk go to prison.
Right.
And the first time around, it was the 1890s after Reconstruction. They started pushing more folk into prison, especially our folk in prison, because they moved from the enslaved labor to convict labor. So that still exists.
Right, today.
And of course, I believe in accountability, but there are a lot of people that haven't done anything, or that didn't get the same level of representation, or that didn't have the same opportunity that maybe a similarly situated majority person had. And that's a problem.
Right.
Everybody should have the same opportunity if they're similarly situated.
Right. So we talked about, you kind of touched upon skewed narratives. So we're going to pivot over to some of the questions that we had personally for you. And you were the first Black African-American professor at the Catawba College, correct?
I was the first African-American male that was full-time.
Male.
There was an African-American female
Okay.
who was in library sciences, phenomenal lady. So I'm not gonna take her credit despite me loving to be number one, but but you think about it, I started there in 2001, which is a long time ago,
Yeah.
but you think about it, historically, it's not that long ago.
Right.
And we're still in a circumstance where we're still doing the first thing. It's like it's 2023 almost.
And that's the question I wanted to ask you. Why are so many of us still being the first to doing things? Like, why is it that there's still first Black man to do this, first Black man to do that? Why are we still dealing with that narrative?
Honestly, I think you look at decision makers. I don't think it's a question of talent. I don't think it's a question of intellect. I think it's a question of who's making the determination about who will be in those spaces.
Right.
Oftentimes, you know folk that are no more qualified than if you have a 4-year-old nephew, but they've got a great position.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that's across the board, but there is a distinct way that companies hire, corporations hire, and even government entities sometimes hire. So I think that's the issue. Who's in control of making those decisions? Now, I'm not saying anybody needs to get a job just because they're African American, Afro Latino, whatever, Asian, Native American, but if they're qualified, I think they deserve a look.
Absolutely.
Also on that topic, a little off, but looking at the number of, we're in Charlotte, so we see a lot of African American attorneys, but there are like 5,700 attorneys in Mecklenburg County. And out of that 5,700 attorneys, probably about 350
Wow.
or 400 of them are Black. So we see a lot, but when you look at the grand
Picture.
scheme or the percentages, it's really not that many. And then you also look at where are the majority of them practicing. You go uptown to the big buildings where all the money is made and the mergers and acquisitions are happening. You don't see a lot of us. Actually, I went up the other day to a firm because the U.S. prosecutor, Honorable Dina King, was doing a presentation on white collar crime. I wanted to get to the firm just to see what it was like. And there wasn't a lot of us. I think I saw 2 or 3. and that's a big firm making a lot of money.
Right.
Yeah. So just working on the decision makers to give folk a fair chance, an equitable chance.
These are harsh realities to accept. And I think maybe even in your career path, you have faced some treacherous times and you had to face with some harsh realities. Earlier we talked about getting through the pandemic. That was a new experience for us all.
For everybody, yeah.
Right. But we all face trauma. We all face challenges, whether it be in our career path or in our personal lives. What are some of the things that you had to deal with? And how were you able to get through them through your career, you know?
Horrific abuse, child deaths, those are the worst. Horrific child sexual abuse. I've had a father perp on his biological daughter and create a baby from that situation. Those type of circumstances can wear you down because you expect more out of people. That person actually had me looking at his parents sideways. I'm like, how were you raised? What are you doing? And his parents are like upstanding people. Sometimes it's just the people and what is in them at that point in time. So in terms of dealing with that, you had to stay prayed up. So I'm glad that we started with prayer.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say I work out, but I eat more than I work out. So we're trying to find that balance and just looking at the reality. People are people. People make mistakes. People are not perfect. I'm not perfect. You cannot expect perfection out of people. What you expect is if they're offered resources, help push them forward so they can utilize those resources and be the best person they can be or the best parent they can be. I think there are few people that are unredeemable. Now, there are some folk that, like, I can't even watch the Jeffrey Dahmer dramatization mess. I could not watch that.
Yeah.
I watch like 5 minutes. I can't watch that.
Yeah.
No. So,
I'm right there with
redeemable,
you.
probably not.
Right.
No, but other folk, no, you got a substance abuse issue, you can be all right if you get on the right path.
Right.
You got mental health issues, you take your meds, you do some therapy, you can be okay. If you learn patterns that are not based upon power and control, you're not hitting your partner. You can do better. Now, the cliche is, we don't always do better because we don't know better. Now, there's an opportunity for us to know better. Let's do better.
Right. Absolutely. One more question that we wanted to ask. This one is also coming from us. So they said more and more children are going unsupervised because of their parents having to go to work. New York raised the age of charging 16 and 17-year-old children as adults. North Carolina is now the only state that has not raised the age.
Well, fortunately, we raised the age about 2 years ago.
Oh, we did?
Yeah, fortunately, we did that. So now the age of criminal culpability is 18. However, if you're charged with some horrific or bad circumstance crime like murder, rape, robbery, they can, when I say they, the DA's office can transfer that to adult court, superior court.
Okay, so that was changed.
Yeah,
Okay.
fortunately.
Okay, good. That's a fact. It's a fact check for us. So, Attorney Smith, one more question. According to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights for all United States, 60% of defendants are detained pretrial because they can't afford to post bail. With an increase of people who abuse the U.S. dollar and use money to get out of jail, how do you think we need to protect our people by the U.S. dollar and those who are not?
No, as a former prosecutor, we always looked at whether or not the person was a safety risk first, flight risk secondly, and made determinations about whether or not they were released on bond. Mecklenburg has pretrial release where it offers the opportunity for a number of individuals to get out a little earlier without financial obligations. They may be monitored by the county, but it does put them on the streets because of course there's a concern. Jail is pretrial confinement. You haven't been convicted of anything in most cases when you're in jail. So, bail, question, did Jeffrey Dahmer deserve bail? No.
No.
Some folk don't need bail, but then the majority of folk that are engaged in criminal activities is not nearly as substantial or significant as something like that. There are a lot of nonviolent offenders that need to be able to utilize pretrial release or non-cash bonds.
So can you explain what a non-cash bond is?
Where you, let's say you get a $5,000 bond, but it's unsecured, so you don't have to come up with any money. Versus a cash bond, $5,000, you got to come up with 10 to 15%.
You know, if you asked me to bond out tonight at 5,000, I couldn't get out. You know, so that's a reality for a lot of folks.
Wow.
You know,
Do you think that's sometimes why our people are targeted?
that's a heavy question. Targeted. Historically, what I'd ask you to do is read the history of how we became so involved in this prison industrial complex. When I say we, I'm talking about people of color. And I don't know if it's so much targeting now, but I think people stereotype certain populations, and it's so easy to say, oh, my man with dreads is obviously a dope boy. He could like a doggone preacher.
Right.
You know, we don't know. You're prejudging. I do the same thing when I'm in Rowan County. I see one of those guys in a pickup truck. It's like, I'm prejudging him. He may be the nicest person in the world. We all profile.
Right.
But it's adverse when we profile folk for no other reason than they look a certain way.
Right. It's a stereotype.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for our community questions. Just wanted to know, do you have any organizations that you're involved with that you would like to do a shout out to?
Yeah, 100 Black Men of Charlotte, phenomenal organization. Aaron Means is the president. All Aaron cares about is the children. If you're not about the children, you can kick rocks. That is his thing. Children, children, children. I'm also involved with Sigmas of Charlotte. We also have a mentoring group, a mentoring program called the Sigma Beta Club, ages 9 to 18. So we're also working with youth in that component. My church, Mount Carmel Baptist, is very forward thinking in terms of providing services. And that's one thing about the church. I don't want the church just to be limited to the walls. You got to go out in the community.
Absolutely.
If you're a follower of Jesus, you're going to be out in the streets. You know,
Right.
Jesus was in the streets. So that's those are the orgs. And got to send a shout out to my lovely wife for dealing with me for like 27 years, because I am a difficult person. And my lovely daughter, Celeste Smith, who I indicated is a TV reporter down in Wilmington, North Carolina. She's doing her thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to say to the voters who haven't voted yet, or to people that are still like on the fence?
I'm gonna give you the cliche. We need you to vote. We need people to vote. It's not going to be worthwhile to complain about the rights that are restricted, the voting rights that are taken away if we're not out there voting. Also, if you have an opportunity, pull up this Louisiana case. I can't remember the name of the case, but they are working on reclassifying what it means to be black. Okay, that's race neutral. That sounds. No, it's not about race neutrality. You're going to give folk, especially people of color, voting rights. So once, because Louisiana was the state pretty much with the one drop rule. If you're black and you're not black. That's going to the Supreme Court. United States Supreme Court, I'll say, is different. Very different.
Wow. You guys heard it here. Early voting up until November 5th. Make sure to get out there. Voting day. Thank you so much, Attorney Keith Smith. Thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate you answering our questions and informing the community on how important it is. And thank you all for joining Red Tape, and make sure to know and learn your rights.
Thank you again. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.